Megan, you're the timer. You can raise your hand and make sure everybody knows. Welcome, everybody. Good morning. So my name is Jason Ewas. I'm the director of the Mayor's Economic Mobility Lab at the City of Boston, and I'm here to moderate this panel, so I won't be speaking for that long. So this panel is called Understanding Inequality, New Methods and Their Insights. So we know that there were a few other very interesting panels going on, and we know that you have a choice in panels, and we thank you for choosing us today. Resilient Boston and Moving Through Boston are very interesting as well and definitely relate to this work. So I'll talk for just 1 minute about the kind of mayor's thoughts on economic inequality. So this issue is front and center for the mayor and his administration, as evidenced through the Imagine Boston 2030 plan, which was framed around expanding opportunity. So that plan is now in implementation phase. There are a bunch of things going on with it. I encourage you to read it. It's long, it's 300 pages, so get ready. But there are a lot of pictures and graphs in there as well. But also understanding that economic inequality is a major issue in Boston. Obviously, we're one of the most economically unequal cities in the country. We've made a little bit of progress. But an important thing that the mayor noted and that we all should note is that inequality is broken down along racial lines. And recognizing that, the mayor got a grant from the Rockefeller Foundation for the Resilience and Racial Equity Strategy, which came out last summer and which is also an implementation phase. I encourage people to also read that document. I'm giving you a lot of homework. I apologize, but it's good, I promise. And look into sort of the work that the city's doing there, which I won't go into because we're not here today to talk about that. I'll sort of end with the Economic Mobility Lab. So that's the work that I'm leading and a team is leading at the city. That work is funded by the Rockefeller Foundation. We're in a planning year coming out of Imagine Boston 2030, coming out of the Resilience and Racial Equity Strategy at the city, and coming out of a bunch of other plans that the city has had. The first half of the year we're sort of wrapping up, and that has been focused on research, so understanding what kind of these folks are presenting, looking at new approaches to understanding economic inequality, and also understanding what the city can do to address it, right? Understanding that there are other larger systems at play, so there's state and federal policy and philanthropic dollars and policy, but trying to really figure out what the city could do. And as we move into the next phase, we're really looking to identify actionable pilots and items to move forward. So thinking about scalable policy, thinking about things that can really get at the underlying causes of economic inequality and work with researchers, internal and external, to understand those underlying roots even better, and then to evaluate policies as we roll them out. So that's the background on that. I will introduce the panelists, and then they will present. So I'll briefly go on the line. First, we'll have Dolores Acevedo-Garcia, who is a Samuel F. and Rose B. Gingold Professor of Human Development and Social Policy at the Heller School of Social Policy and Management at Brandeis University. She is presenting today at Brandeis about diversitydatakids.org. And she'll tell you more about that. I'll introduce each panelist sort of before they present, so I don't just barrage you now. The format for today is that they will give 10-minute presentations each, and then we'll have 15 to 20 minutes of discussions at the end of it. So without further ado, Dolores.
Thank you, Jason. Thank you for coming to this panel. And I'm representing the diversitydatakids.org project and the Heller School at Brandeis University. We are very happy to be part of the BARI conference this year. We've been talking to Sam and Dan a lot about data and research in the last year, so it's exciting to be here. Thank you. I'm gonna talk today about one of our main data products, which is the Child Opportunity Index. But I encourage you to please check out also our diversitydatakids.org website, which is the public face of a project that we have entirely dedicated to issues of equity among children in Boston, but really across the country. We are going to talk about the motivation and construction for the Child Opportunity Index. We are going to show you some of the findings that we have from analyzing the data for Boston. And then, most importantly, we are going to introduce some of the applications that we are seeing of the Child Opportunity Index, and we hope to discuss those more during the panel discussion at the end. So why does this matter? Why did we set out to develop a neighborhood opportunity index with a focus on children? We have increasing evidence that neighborhoods are a very important developmental context for children. What that means is that the environment where children grow in terms of neighborhood environment has an impact not only on outcomes during childhood, but beyond during the life course on outcomes later in adulthood, such as earnings and college attendance. In addition to that, we already heard this morning, of course, we have very stark patterns of residential segregation. That means that children live in very different neighborhoods by race and ethnicity and also by family income. So we potentially have, of course, very large differences or inequities in terms of neighborhood opportunities for healthy child development. And we set out to understand these patterns and try to provide data to do something about them with this project, which we call the Child Opportunity Index. How is this index different than other indices that are around? Of course, there is a lot of data on neighborhoods today. There are a number of different ways in which our index is unique. One of them is that we started the project with a focus on understanding patterns of equity among children. So the whole idea was to try to document this issue of equity. The indicators that we use are specific about children's environments, so that's another part that is unique. We wanted to go beyond neighborhood poverty. The research evidence shows that poverty as a marker of neighborhood environment has an important influence of child outcomes, but we wanted to go beyond that and look at other dimensions of neighborhoods because neighborhoods are multidimensional. And we wanted to look at both resources for healthy child development and challenges. We also wanted to be comprehensive. There were a number of indices that had been developed for specific areas of the country, but we wanted to tackle the task of developing the index for the 100 largest metro areas in the country so that we would have a population-level picture of equity. And finally, very importantly, we decided that we wanted to provide a data tool that would allow not only us as a research team, but everyone to look at the implications of these inequity patterns in terms of the implications for child well-being, health, education, et cetera, and also, very importantly, to examine whether policies are promoting equitable access to neighborhood opportunity, very specifically housing policy, but other other policies as well. So we defined child neighborhood opportunity as the set of neighborhood-based conditions and resources that can promote healthy child development. And the index itself is a measure of relative opportunity within a metropolitan area, all the neighborhoods within a metropolitan area. The neighborhood index that we developed, instead of just looking at poverty or some measures of socioeconomic disadvantage, has three domains. It has an educational domain, which includes things like access to high-quality early childhood education. It has a health and environment domain that includes things like access to parks and open spaces. And it has a socioeconomic opportunity domain that includes things like proximity to jobs. So you can have access to the index on our website, either all the domains combined or by subdomain. So we have actually 4 different indices. So how do we work with this data? We standardize the indicators and we combine them into a single score that we call the Child Opportunity Index. And that is developed for each of the census tracts within a metropolitan area. Then we rank the scores and we divide the neighborhoods in 5 different groups, from the lowest opportunity scores to the highest opportunity scores. So the 20% of neighborhoods that have the lowest scores we call very low opportunity, which is highlighted here on this map in light yellow. And then we have the second 20%, which is neighborhoods with low opportunity, moderate opportunity, high and very high opportunity. So this is the map for the Boston metropolitan area. Each of the little areas is a census tract or neighborhood. This is just greater Boston. A nice feature that we have is that you can overlay the child population of different racial groups. This map is showing where Black children live in relation to opportunity in the Boston area. We use this data, the index and then the population overlays, to look at a number of different things. One of the things that we can look at is the distribution of children across levels of neighborhood opportunity. This chart is showing 5 different levels from very low to very high, and shows the distribution of Asian children and white children in the Boston metropolitan area. What you can see, that's the part that I marked with a circle there, is that low proportions of white children and Asian children live in very low opportunity neighborhoods in the Boston metro area. I'm going to show you now the distribution of Black and Latino children. and you can see that it's a mirror image. Incredibly high proportions of Black and Latino children live in the very lowest opportunity neighborhoods. And we have the distinction that Boston, in the analysis we've done, is the metropolitan area with the highest concentration of Latino children in very low opportunity neighborhoods. We are the worst in the country in that sense. A lot of people think that this may be related to Black and Latino families being more likely to be poor, therefore less likely to afford housing in higher opportunity areas. So in order to kind of examine that issue, we look at children in poor families only, separate from other children. So this is the graph for poor children in the Boston area, and you can see that higher proportions of Asian and white children that live in poor families are in very low opportunity neighborhoods, which we would expect because their families would be less likely to afford housing in other areas. However, when we look at Hispanic and Black children, even when we focus just on poor children, we see very, very large inequities. So income is not the whole story for sure. Our data also allow you to look at finer breakdowns, such as national origin, and you see very different pictures for example, Cambodian versus Chinese people in the Boston area. Another thing that we've done is we have done a lot of analysis looking at housing, and this is showing the distribution of rental housing units appropriate for low-income families with children in the Boston area. The first part of the graph is showing you the distribution of rental housing units with less than 2 bedrooms, and you can see that those are very uniformly distributed across levels of neighborhood opportunity. However, housing units with 3 or more bedrooms are very, very concentrated in very low opportunity neighborhoods. And we can talk more during the panel discussion that this is not an accident. This is very much a matter of zoning and very much by design. So the most important part about the data that we put together is that we have done a lot of analysis that we think are very important and very cool. I think most academics feel like that about their own work. But we have seen that our data have been taking a life of their own. People have been using the data for different purposes really across the country, and in some cases we don't even know about it. We just see the final product when they get to, back to us about, oh, I published this paper, or I did this report. And I'm showing you very quickly now 3 examples for the Boston area, and we can talk more about others later. This is a piece that was on the front page of the Globe. This is David Schanfenberg that has been doing some digging into the inequity patterns in the Boston region, and he took our Child Opportunity Index to look at the distribution of affordable housing in Boston in relation to opportunity. So that was a very cool collaboration with David. And we also have colleagues at the Boston Medical Center, the Vital Village Network, that have been linking our Child Opportunity Index with crime data and also with their own electronic medical records for pediatric patients, trying to understand the distribution of child health conditions across Boston in relation to opportunity. And finally, this is my last slide, we also have colleagues from the American City Coalition. Alex and others are going to be presenting later today after lunch. They have taken our data to look at issues of housing mobility in the Boston area, and this slide that I'm showing here is a very interesting application that they are developing that allows low-income families to, on their phone, put together some picture of the neighborhood that they want to live in, for example, a neighborhood of high educational opportunity, and then find affordable housing units that map onto those characteristics of neighborhoods that are important to them, hopefully promoting better choices, neighborhood choices for them. So that's my presentation today. I look forward to the discussion. Oh, sorry. Nancy is reminding me that we have 2 handouts about our project that are on that table. Thank you.
Thank you, Dolores. I meant to ask this at the beginning, and so to break things up a little bit, I'll ask now. How many people in this room are academics? Just to get a sense of the crowd. Okay, maybe like 40%. How many consider yourselves practitioners? All right, the other half. Who doesn't fall in that group? Who's a groupie here? Okay. Nice. Okay, great. Just wanted to get a sense of sort of, as we think about the panel, what kinds of questions that we want to ask. So now I'll introduce Ryan Wang, who's an assistant professor of civil and let me get it right, environmental engineering at Northeastern University, who's presenting on human mobility and urban isolation in Boston.
Jason mentioned, my topic will be on human mobility and urban isolation in Boston. This is actually part of a larger project and collaborating with researchers from Harvard University, Nolan, Rob. The research motivated by one established research, which is that social isolation is a very important social issue. It's established research already shows that social isolation undermines life chances. And for sure, sorry, yeah. Is this better?
Yes.
Cool. Also, it shows that for young people, it's limited their access to the middle-class role models, safe environments, and maybe institutional resources. And for adults, also social isolation limits their access to the job informations. So it causes a lot of limitations for their life chances. However, those research basically have an assumption is that the social interactions limited to the neighborhood of the residents, meaning that when we understand social isolation, we mostly look at where people are living, what type of neighborhood they are living at. But that assumption can be questionable, especially in this more mobile society, right? Think about us. We don't spend 24/7 in our house, in our own neighborhood. You guys are, leave your house, come to this conference. Some of you maybe come from far away. And you can actually have the opportunity to interact with people living outside of your residential neighborhood, and that can actually give you more interactions. So, but that, the assumption is questionable, but historically it has been a very hard question to answer because most of the time we don't have enough data. Some of those data are more analysis beyond the residential neighborhood. Some of the data are more static, like surveys, field experiments, or tax records. It take a snapshot of individuals and mostly also where people are from. And then other data, more dynamic data, are usually more small scales, right? Some of these are travel diaries, GPS, and small scale phone apps. It's can find some more dynamic data where people are going, but hard to expand that to a larger scale. So motivated by that, here's the research question we are asking, which is, do isolation and segregation persist beyond residential neighborhoods? And to answer that, we're trying to use three different, shows a little weird here. So basically we use we focus on three indexes to understand the mobility patterns. One is radius, which is the average distance people travels. You are from different kind of neighborhood, how far you travel. The second one is spread, which is number of the different neighborhood you tend to travel on your daily routines. And the third one is actually called composition, which is the proportion of your visited neighborhoods are actually mainstream neighborhood. And the mainstream here does not reflect our belief, but it's basically related to the prevalent neighborhoods. Usually, mainly we examined the white neighborhood, non-poor neighborhood, and non-poor white neighborhood. So here are more details about our analysis. We used Twitter data collected from Twitter API, and for Boston area, we collected 2.34 million geotag tweets around the entire commuting zone around Boston. And that data is collected from 18 months, October 1st, 2013 to March 31st, 2015. We analyzed the Twitter data and try to estimate the home locations of each individual. And the figure here, each dot there actually shows the estimated home location for each Twitter users. And the red dots are actually individuals who estimate are living inside of Boston boundaries. And that is about 7,300 individuals, represent about 1.12% of the population in Boston in 2015. Like I said, we analyzed three parameters. The first one is radius, the mean travel distance. And the left panel shows the distribution of the distances. And you can see the median radius is about 3.7 kilometers, meaning that typically people will travel about 3.7 million kilometers from their house to the other areas. On the right panel, we break the neighborhood into 6 different types of neighborhood. They are non-pro-white, non-pro-black, non-pro-Hispanic, pro-white, pro-black, pro-Hispanic neighborhood. And we analyze people from this 6 type of neighborhood, how far they tend to travel. And we can see that there are radius, the mean travel distance are actually very comparable from the different type of neighborhood. Then we try to analyze the spread, which is the number of visited neighborhood. And again, you actually see they are very comparable. And here you actually see that people from non-pro-black and pro-black neighborhood actually have a highest number of different visited neighborhoods. Then we analyze the composition. I think when it converts it, the formula shows a bit weird. But then we analyze basically composition of the travels, the travel to non-pro-white neighborhood. The formula didn't show up, but we basically use the number of neighborhoods you travel, the number of visited non-pro-white neighborhood divided by the number of neighborhood you visited. Let's say for all your visited neighborhood, 10 of them are non-pro-white and 18 are all the neighborhood you visited. So 10 divided by 18. Then we minus the baseline. The baseline is the proportion of non-pro-white neighborhood in the entire commuting zone of Boston. And that number is 80% here, meaning that if you randomly walk around Boston, 80% of a chance you're going to end up visiting a non-pro-white neighborhood. So we use that formula to calculate the proportion, and again, we break that into different type of neighborhood. And you can see that the proportion from non-pro-white neighborhood is almost at the baseline level. But then when we look at pro-black neighborhood, it's actually well below the the baseline, 47% a point below the neighborhood, below the baseline. And another thing we observed is that if you look at non-pro-black and pro-black, basically the second box plot and the 5th box plot, they are very similar. So for non-pro-black neighborhoods, people from non-pro-black neighborhoods, it doesn't perform that well. They are very comparable. And shows that race in this case actually trumps the economic class characteristics. And then, like I said, it belongs to a larger research project. And we want to see, does the pattern we observed in Boston actually hold across 50 most populous cities in the United States? And that's exactly what we did. Again, we analyzed radius, and across 50 cities, the radius follows very similar distributions, and the mean radians are very similar across 6 types of neighborhood. For the spread, the number of neighborhoods visited across 50 cities, again, they are very comparable. Actually, again, the people from non-pro-black neighborhood and pro-black neighborhood are actually doing better on this side. But then when we move to the composition, we observe the exact same pattern. People from non-pro-white neighborhoods, they very close or above the baseline. But for non-pro-black and pro-black neighborhoods, the people from there are significantly below the baseline. They have very limited chance to be exposed to the non-pro-white neighborhoods. So with that, here's our conclusions. Really are comparable across different neighborhoods, no matter if we are looking at Boston or we are looking at 50 different cities. Same thing for spread. It's very comparable across different neighborhoods. However, we do observe that residents of poor minority neighborhoods are less exposed to mainstream neighborhoods. I've got to say that the first 2 are supported by research, very similar to the findings reported by previous research on smaller scales. But for the 3rd one, we definitely see that residents from poor minorities are less exposed to mainstream neighborhood. And also, with that, we think that despite the increasing diversities, race still matters more than poverty when we look at social isolations. And that's the finding, all the finding we have. Here are some references, and I'm looking forward to our discussions.
Thank you, Ryan. We'll move right along. Next up is Anise Vance of Boston Indicators and the Boston Foundation. So Anise is the Senior Manager of Research in Race and Equity at Boston Indicators, and will be presenting on measuring segregation in Boston. So following up from that last presentation.
Thank you. Can everyone hear me? Awesome. I think the title of this panel said something about new models and insights. I think my role is to present the old stuff, frankly. Also, I gotta tell you, yesterday someone at my office, I'm not gonna tell you who, started a rumor that I was in my mid-20s, so I felt really good the whole day. And now this is a pretty good reality check that I'm old enough to be talking about some of the older measures. I am going to start this presentation by talking about the isolation index and the dissimilarity index. I'm going to walk you through them really quickly, but I just want you to know what they are so that when I reference them, you you're on the same page a little bit. Does that sound okay? Are there any geography or sociology professors in here? Fantastic. Oh, there's one? Okay. So you're not going to be well pleased maybe with some of the but we'll try to do this. So the isolation index, it's a measure of isolation. Like it says, people often use it for segregation, but it's actually not really a measure of segregation. It's measured just for one group. So you would say a black person or a white Asian person. It's not between two groups. You'll see the dissimilarity index is between two groups. The basic definition people often give is for an average member of a group, what percentage of their neighborhood is from the same group. Now, if you look at that visualization, which is just square blocks. I call it visualization because I want to be fancy. If you look at that, you'll see that in that situation, orange is completely isolated. In this situation, orange is not isolated at all. The big black lines are the neighborhoods there, right? So like a census tract, for example, right? Make sense, sort of, right? Okay. The dissimilarity index is a measure of evenness, so that's how evenly two groups are spread across a space in relation to one another, right? So that's where you're gonna get a comparison. You're gonna say black people and white people or Asian people and Hispanic people have this sort of relationship in a given space. Again, the percentage of one population that would have to move to produce perfect evenness. That's what people often kind of describe it as. The easier way to imagine it is in that visualization that's perfectly uneven. When we go like that, those are supposed to be, I don't know if you can see the white stripes in between, but that's supposed to be perfect evenness. Make sense? Okay. One other thing on these measures is that usually they're standardized from 0 to 100. If you're above 60, that's really bad. It means you're very segregated. If you're between 40 and 60, it means you're segregated, but that's kind of what we see in the US. If you're below 40, you're doing pretty well. And if you're below 30, great job, you know? A couple other notes on these measures is that these are, and I think the presentation we just saw speaks to this so well, there's a lot of nuance and complexity to this. These are just it's one measure of segregation. You can get a lot of different measures that are gonna tell you a lot of different things. This is a snapshot, so please don't take it as kind of hard and fast truth. So in Boston, racial segregation is high, relatively high, and is going down. Before we get into actually the racial segregation charts, one thing I did want to note, though, is that these measures are dependent on how big a population is, right? So just to give you a kind of a quick example, if I was the only black person in this room, it's super hard for me to be segregated from everybody else, right? Because you're just one person amongst all these people. If half of this room was black and half of this room was white, all the black people could be here, all the white people would be here, and we'd have complete segregation. A lot easier to segregate when you have bigger populations. So, you know, given that, it's important to understand the population trend in a particular place, which is why this first chart is about population trend since 1980. As we can see, Boston is becoming less white, and that's white non-Hispanic for those who would want that definition. That's white non-Hispanic. The black population has actually stayed pretty much the same. Hispanic population has obviously grown. Asian population has also grown significantly. That blue line at the top is some other race or two or more race. That comes to about 2 to 4%. Okay, so Boston's racial distribution has become more even. What we see is, oh, interesting. Oh, we don't have the, it's supposed to there say like white dash black, white dash X, da da da, but apparently there wasn't enough space. I apologize for that. Anyway, the point is that across the different dimensions, you're seeing this drop over time. The first dimension that you see is white dash black. You'll notice that that's still, even in 2010, which is the yellow bar, that still is super high. That's above 60, 69.2, super segregated, not great at all. But again, the general trend, good. All Bostonians are less isolated except for Hispanic people. Now, why that is probably just because the Hispanic population is getting larger, so you have more opportunity for segregation. Again, the interesting relationship between diversity and segregation. Oh, I have 5 minutes? Okay, fantastic, thank you. But again, mostly good news here. Income segregation, relatively low, but going up, right? So this is, oh, again, this happened to the charts, huh? The lower income population of Boston is less concentrated than in other large metro areas. Right at the end, the place where it says B and then it's orange, that's Boston. Those other 10 are the 10 largest metro areas in the country. And this chart is just showing that the share of lower income households that are concentrated in lower income settings in Boston is relatively low compared to other places. We see the same trend when we look at upper income houses in relation to other places, right? Boston, again, all the way at the end there. That was a surprising finding when we found that. We actually thought that Boston would have a lot of income segregation in comparison to other metro areas, but these are what the numbers show. Something to note, though, on these, some of these areas, like Houston's on this, Dallas is on this, LA is on this, these are sprawling areas where the geographies are very different, right? So income segregation in those spaces means something very different, right? So it might feel more income segregated in Boston than it does in one of those places. Okay, and then following on from those, Boston has experienced less income growth than the other 10 largest metro areas in the last 30, 40 years, which again, good news, there still is income growth, so that's not great news. We did not start from a position where everyone was integrated and now we just have slight segregation. We still have a significant amount of income segregation, okay? Do I have like 2 minutes? Something like that? Okay, so we also wanted to just give you a quick snapshot of comparability to other cities. We took cities that were the same, sort of the same in terms of density, in terms of population size, and in terms of racial makeup, and we were wondering kind of what we looked at like in comparison to them. We're doing okay in comparison to comparable cities. Sorry that I'm going through these so fast, folks. I just want to make sure that we kind of get to a happy place. Unevenness between black and white populations in those comp cities. Again, Boston super high in that category, so we still see a lot of the tension around segregation is around race, which I think is something that speaks really well to the presentations that we've seen before. There are a couple other slides in here, but I don't want to do those. I actually wanted to point to something else that isn't in this deck. We looked at Boston neighborhoods in particular, and we were trying to understand which Boston neighborhoods are actually the most integrated. What neighborhoods can we look to as potential models for the city as a whole? There were 3 neighborhoods that were most reflective of citywide racial populations. Those 3 neighborhoods were Roslindale, Mission Hill, and the South End. JP was like a sort of. There were also 3 neighborhoods that had at least 10% of their population from each of the 4 major racial and ethnic groups that we see in Boston. Those 3, again, Mission Hill, South End, Dorchester, and JP sort of. JP's always that sort of neighborhood, like in any conversation. Let's see. I think that's all I had, and I think I'm out of time. Thank you all so much.
Thank you, Anise. And last but not least, we have Phillip Brenner, who's at UMass Boston. He's an associate professor of sociology from the College of Liberal Arts. He's the director of the graduate certificate program on survey research, and he's a senior research fellow at the Center for Survey Research, so he knows about surveys. He'll be presenting on Shining a Beacon on Economic Inequality and Mobility in Boston. Phillip.
Great. I'm really excited to be here telling you about a brand new project we're launching at UMass Boston in the Center for Survey Research. I acknowledge my colleagues, Trent Buskirk, who's the director of the center, and Russ Shute, a professor in the Department of Sociology. Beacon is a brand new panel survey of Boston, and I'll tell you what all of those words mean and a lot more about Beacon. Beacon has its roots in a history of surveys about cities and of cities. These go back primarily to the Boston Area Survey, which was a project of the Department of Sociology at the University of Michigan. They are now updated for the times. A series of studies called the Be Heard Network, started by our colleagues at Temple University in Philly, but are expanding quickly throughout the country. What Beacon does is expands on this, these roots of urban surveys, moving them online, as most things are, but with some interesting extensions of the history of urban surveys, and some, we think, extensions on the other studies in the BHERD network. So first, it's online. We are doing our, as I'll show you, our sampling in different neighborhoods in Boston, but we're quickly moving people online and doing our surveys initially on the web. But we're building in capacity to do lots of other types of measurement, not just boring old web surveys, but also data collection using text messaging, social network or organic, what we call organic data collection, as well as just about any way you can collect data on a smartphone. And as we're learning in the news a lot lately, that's a lot of different ways we can integrate those into Beacon. It is a probability-based survey. Unlike some of the BHERD surveys that I briefly showed you on that first slide, we are improving on those designs by sampling Bostonians using an address-based sample. Now, the benefit of that is that we can make generalizations to Bostonians in general and at the neighborhood level. We're sampling from 25 different neighborhoods in Boston. We've been working closely with our colleagues at BARI to be able to make estimates at the neighborhood level and comparisons between neighborhoods. It's also a panel study, and by that I mean it's a longitudinal study. We're recruiting folks into the panel so that we can study them over time and look at change over time at the individual level. So change at the individual level, change between neighborhoods, and generalizations to Boston. This is a very powerful design, and we are very excited to be launching it. The first wave of data collection is moving out right now. If you are a Boston resident, you may receive a letter or a postcard from us. Allow me to make my personal plea. We'd love to hear from you if you're sampled. If you're not, just hold on. We'll be doing some more sampling in the very near future, and we'd love to hear from you then. This very first wave of data collection will be collecting a number of different measures, including assessments of Bostonians' views of their neighborhood, views of living in the city, measures of collective efficacy and social cohesion, social mobility, physical activity, which is one of the things I study, and I wedged it in there because it's my baby and I can study physical activity if I want to. Depression, use of technology and social media, as well as a suite of demographic variables. What else can Beacon do? Lots of different things. We can link respondents' perceptions, their attitudes, their opinions, a number of different types of behavioral measures back to administrative record data that's already pulled together by BARI, which is a really neat design. We can take advantage of natural events that happen in Boston. The recent floods that were happening this winter after, was it 3 or 4 nor'easters in a row? After something like that happens, we can very quickly launch a snap poll of Beacon members to hear about their troubles in traveling around the city, or whether it took them longer to get to work, whether they had to stay home, or what have you. We can use Beacon in these sorts of very quick ways to understand changes in the city as a result of essentially a natural experiment. We can do this by SMS, by web, or a number of different ways. We can link back to social network data, like Twitter data, as we heard in a talk earlier today, or Facebook posts, to link our respondent level data back to these social network data. We can also, and this may be the most interesting part of all of this, we can lower your cost dramatically. If you have an idea for a study and not a lot of funding, our costs are an order of magnitude or less. We're looking at perhaps a one question for $2,500 with multiple item discounts, really allowing us to take advantage of a panel that's already in existence to lower costs for researchers, and much more. So how can you get involved in Beacon? If you have an idea, something you want to study about Boston residents, you can get a question from 1 to lots of questions. We can white label an entire survey for you, and we would love to talk to you about that, or arrange for a more complex or longitudinal design. You can email us at beacon@umb.edu or send a comment directly to me. My email address is here. I've also got business cards. I'm happy to talk to you after this. My Twitter account is also on there, and I'd be happy to take comments there. And I look forward to talking with you more about it in the Q&A.
Thank you, everybody. That was great. So now we'll have Q&A. I have 1 or 2 questions which I'll start with, and then I've asked each of the panelists to prepare a question. So this will be an internal conversation, and then if there's time, we can open up to 1 or 2 from the audience. I'll also volunteer. I don't know if you're sticking around, but the panelists will stick around and engage with you because this is a large group, and with the mix of policy and policy practitioners and academics, I'm sure there are a lot of questions. So my first question is a sort of preface. A common thread and a kind of obvious thread to all of this work is the importance of place, right? To upward economic mobility, to segregation. Sort of this is building off of the national conversation that was kicked off by Raj Chetty's research and his team's research. So as someone who works at the city, as a policymaker, just wanted to get kind of high-level insights from each panelist on the direction you think policymakers should look based on this research and these findings, and some maybe preliminary thoughts on the kinds of tools that we should be looking at any level, federal, state, city, other. So we can start with whoever wants to start.
I'll start. I don't know if this is on, but anyway, so I think that, I mean, there are potentially a lot of different applications, and we are seeing that with our Child Opportunity Index, but for me personally, and I think for the field, a very important one continues to be understanding how we use housing policy to promote access to opportunity and desegregation. So under the affirmatively furthering fair housing rule, there are data requirements, and all of that is kind of on hold right now for obvious reasons. But I think that it's very important that we are seeing a lot of local governments, local housing authorities, advocates interested in trying to see where is housing, affordable housing for low-income families, different programs such as the low-income housing tax credit, Section 8 vouchers in relation to opportunity, and then of course trying to do something about that. I think it's going to be continue to be a very important part of the conversation. And when we started this project, that was one of the aspirations that we had. We actually wrote a memo to HUD about using our data for the data required for fair housing reporting, and we are seeing a lot more of that kind of action with other projects that are looking at neighborhood data. So I think that's the main point.
Sure, I'll go next. First of all, I'm a data scientist and an engineer trying to do social science, so maybe I hope what I said makes sense. But from our analysis, our data sources, you see we're trying to understand mobility, but it's still, from my perspective, a bit abstract, theoretical. We know we know the difference of probably exposure, but we don't know how people are interact during their mobility. What kind of places, what kind of people are they interact? Of course, mobility is a very important dimension. It's a prerequisite of those more in-depth interactions and exposures. But I really hope to see that if there are tools can build on to enhance those kind of interactions and actually provide source of data, value of data for us to quantify, how those, are there meaningful interactions happening and how we can improve those. That's my 2 cents.
Can everyone hear me okay? Is the mic on? Okay. I think the policy and practice lever question is like so interesting, and there's so many rich answers there in terms of housing subsidies, affordable housing. There's a lot of really creative ways to get at the problem. One thing that I think about a lot, though, is what is our desired end state? And I don't think we have agreement on that. Right? When it comes to segregation, when it comes to kind of any of these topics, what is our desire? Do we want every neighborhood in Boston to look like Boston's population in general? Do we want some neighborhoods to be more black or more Asian or more Hispanic or whatever? And as you walk through some of these neighborhoods, some people really like that about their neighborhoods, right? That's a real thing that we see. That's not a reason to segregate. Please don't get me wrong at all. But what I do want to say is that I think there's a broader conversation that we need to have here about what is it that we're actually trying to shift and change, and what is that end state that we're trying to get to. Clearly, one of the pivotal things is removing barriers to people integrating. There is a question of, well, do we want to encourage folks to integrate? And if we do want to encourage that, then we have to take it a lot more seriously than maybe we have been taking in the past. Has anyone read Richard Rothstein's book, by the way, Color of Law? Fantastic, yeah, a few people have. Fantastic book that makes this case that we've so systematically divided people that we actually need to, now there's an onus on, there's a responsibility on government, on civic leaders, on a broad range of populations to actively desegregate and actively integrate, which is not necessarily an approach that we've taken before. We've just talked about dismantling segregation as opposed to creating integration.
I would just add that we are measuring perceptions of neighborhoods, what Bostonians like about their neighborhoods, what they like about the city, what they'd like to see improved. So we'll have more information about that in later this summer.
And there's sort of one more. I'm using my position as moderator to ask two questions. Another question I have is on, and this is maybe for Dolores, but I think it's for the whole panel, on religion. So I'm personal for me. I'm from a low-income Arab Muslim family, and so we're listed as white, but in many ways, my family has faced some difficulties, right? So I was just curious, sort of, if through the data that you're accessing, you're able to assess that information. And I know, given some of the broader trends, they tend to be lower income and higher poverty rates. But just wanted to add that dimension in for all religions and how you're analyzing that through the research.
We haven't analyzed that. The one thing we've done in terms of more disaggregation is looking at national origin groups for Asians and Hispanics, because whenever we present the data, people rightly so point out that there are a lot of differences by national origin, and there are very dramatic differences. We haven't looked at religion, so we don't have data on that, sadly.
Any other panelists have thoughts? Or is that the common answer?
I guess, again, from a data analysis perspective, I think a low-hanging fruit for us, we're actually planning to do is that understand, like, beyond the 6 type of neighborhood, but we want to understand that people from different type of neighborhoods, we should do percentage of foreign born and percentage of different religions, maybe can understand their mobility, find out the mobility pattern. That's a, what do we say? I say the low-hanging fruit, if data is there, it's easy to approach. But again, I feel like harder question, but I think very meaningful, is that how to understand the interactions beyond just where they're going.
Great, and now I will leave it to the panelists to ask questions of themselves, and if we don't have any questions there, then we can go to the audience. We have 15 minutes left.
I see that people have questions already,
Questions?
so
All
why
right.
don't we take those?
Let's do it. Ted, why don't you start? Okay, she got it.
So, how do you assure that the Somalian family in Mission Hill or the Haitian widower in Mattapan or the undocumented person in East Boston isn't grossly underrepresented in your samples? And then a related question that goes directly to the indicators presentation. How would you expect that the values that we aspire to would be articulated? Because all of these studies tend to show current state and what happened before, but if there's a value proposition between having an integrated neighborhood or not, how would you expect that to be articulated?
Should I go first? Okay. So to the first question on sampling, that's a huge issue, right? And we see that often in Boston, particularly with the Native American population, that even in my presentation was not represented because the samples were so, like the margins of errors in the sample, even in the ACS, are so large that it makes the number meaningless, right? So we have to oversample. A great example of an organization that oversamples in its own surveys is the Fenway Institute. They've done a lot of work with the LGBT population, and they continue to oversample in particular racial and ethnic groups to make sure they can report across the LGBTQ spectrum and then also within each of these racial and ethnic demographics. The second question about the value proposition is, like, the short answer is I don't know, but I do know that it's something we need to be talking about in a much more meaningful way, right? I'll give an example of Hyde Park, which is a neighborhood I love in Boston. And I go to Hyde Park, and I think it's just like the greatest thing in the world. If Hyde Park was reflective of Boston's entire population, that neighborhood would shift dramatically. And are we saying that that's something that we want? Right? I don't know the answer to that, but I do know that we aren't having the conversation, and we're particularly not having the conversation. Oh, is my mic going in and out? Am I getting too animated? Is that what's happening? Low key, sorry. I particularly know that we're not having the conversation with community members, right? We're having the conversation, which is fantastic, by the way, in rooms like this. Is absolutely a place we should be having it, but we also need to be having it in all of our, like, various workplaces, and then in the communities we're living in community associations, like the degree to which our community engagement processes need to be amplified. I think none of us have necessarily fully grasped if we do want to get to that end state question that you're raising there, Ted.
I want to answer that question, the second part of the question about the values, because our project, I really didn't have much time to talk about it. We do have a mission statement that is very much centered around putting a lot of value on children of all racial and ethnic groups having decent opportunities for healthy development. So I've been in rooms where people are literally yelling at me as an academic of why do I want integrated neighborhoods, and why do I care about, for example, black-white segregation if I'm, in their perception, Hispanic or whatever. So I think that continues to be a very charged discussion, although I think aspirational as a country, we do have a very clear framework for that, fair housing and other frameworks. But I think in terms of neighborhood environment, we can get away from that discussion, which is always difficult to have if we think about what are the set of resources and conditions that we want for children in their neighborhoods. And when we see the type of disparities that I show on my slides, and that is consistently true across the entire 100 largest metropolitan areas, we have a major problem. The majority of children are going to be non-white very soon. Younger children are already primarily non-white. And Hispanic children, very importantly, are growing as a proportion of the child population. So when you see those disparities, that's a wake-up call for everyone. That is the next generation. People are growing up in those conditions. So people can argue about to what extent we want racial integration, and that word is, again, very charged. But I think I would have a very animated discussion with someone that would tell me that the kind of disparities that we see in opportunities of healthy development are okay.
So we have 10 minutes time for a couple more questions. I'll let the person with the mic choose. There's a lot.
Hi. Okay, so my question is really for the researchers on social mobility and isolation. Sorry, guys. But in terms of like social conversations, I feel like currently a lot of conversations have to do with identity politics and how our identities really determine like where we go, like how we dress and how we speak when we go to where we go, and all of these different conversations that kind of stem from that. But I'm very interested in knowing where you've seen your work applied in these social conversations, and if you haven't seen it applied yet, what areas you see your work being applied in the future.
To be honest, I never thought about that until now. I think that's a very interesting research question. I don't think I have a very good answer. I think, and I also don't know for our data if that support that, and what kind of data, what kind of information we can get to, to think about that questions. For me, again, playing my engineering card again, I feel like for me, a lot of times I want to think, okay, if we have a problem, how I quantify that to make me understand it a little better, and then, what it will be the implications. And I think I don't have a really good answer for that now.
The other panelists want to address that?
I think Dolores' research is really ideal for that, right? These opportunities. Do you want to speak to maybe some ways that's
I don't feel qualified to answer that question. We do research with big data, and we think they're very important because of the reason you mentioned. We want to quantify inequity. That's not the only, obviously, the only angle to look at inequity, but we think it's an important one, and we use large data sets. So in terms of perceptions and identity issues, I defer to the sociologists in the room.
Another question?
I have a question.
So we got one over here, and then you next.
Hi, so I have a comment and a question. So the first one, the comment on the religion question. If I'm not mistaken, the reason why there was so many crickets at that moment was because the census doesn't really collect religion data. I wonder, Phil, if this is something that Beacon could tuck a couple questions in on, so we actually have this in Boston. But beyond having Phil respond to me giving him more work, I have a question, and I think this actually ties into a lot of things that are being said right now, which, well, I mean, I love Ryan's talk because, Ryan, you're capturing this different level of segregation, right? Residential segregation versus kind of mobility segregation. But I wonder if there's a third level of segregation that we're all sort of hinting on here but not getting quite at, which is interaction segregation, right? Behavioral segregation. I mean, so Anise, you mentioned South End as being one of the most, quote, integrated, or at least diverse neighborhoods in the city, but we all know, I mean, I know exactly which census tract it is too, and it's the one with Villa Victoria, or Via Victoria in it, right? And it's well established that Via Victoria kind of operates as an island among the latte and tapas army. You know, and there are literally, so Mario Small, who's a professor at Harvard and one of Ryan's co-authors, in his book about the project, he talks about how there are institutions next door to each other, right? Laundromats, one speaks English, one speaks Spanish, right? And so they're completely divided. And so then I guess my question, and I don't know if this is big data or small data, but how do we measure that? How do we quantify that? And how do we get to understand the level of behavioral segregation, even when physical segregation isn't the case, and if that has consequences for communities?
I think that's such a good question. And also the South End example is the perfect example. Because anytime we mention South End, that's exactly what people say, and it's entirely true. Also, interestingly, New York is one of the most segregated places in the world. You go there and you don't feel like it just because the density is so intense, right? You walk a block and you're interacting with different people, but the census tracts become so small that then it shows a high level of segregation, and there probably isn't that much contact between people, right? So how you measure contact is an incredible question. They're obviously the most, and maybe I should flip this over to Phillip, because obviously the easiest way to do it would just be to kind of ask people in a longitudinal panel survey that someone was starting. I don't know if we have that at all, but maybe.
Dan, I'll pick up your homework question. I'd love to ask questions about religion. It is one of the things that I study in my own work, so you can look forward to seeing those on a Beacon in the near future. About sort of everyday contact, everyday interaction. We have been working with a colleague at UMass who does work like this, where he asks his survey respondents to essentially wear their smartphone around their neck. And it takes pictures and audio snapshots throughout the day to see who they're interacting with and what they're saying. And all of that can be coded in different ways to tap into who's doing the talking, what are they talking about, and who's interacting. Of course, one of the things we can see is that sort of men dominate the conversation when we look at this sort of data at a very high level. When we really dig into it, we can hear what they're saying, what they're talking about, who's interacting with whom. And that's something we certainly could do with Beacon. If our respondents give us the buy-in we hope we're going to see. To get back to one of the very first questions, actually I think it was the first question that was asked from the audience, about whose data we don't have. We are concerned about that. For us, it's not a sampling problem. We can sample those folks as if they don't agree to participate, or they don't feel like they can participate, or if they don't have the means to participate, they don't have a computer or a smartphone or a tablet, or can't get to the library, or don't want to go to the library to use a computer. There are ways we're considering getting around that, not in the first wave, but in the subsequent waves. And we're leaning on our colleagues at Temple, who started Be Heard of Philly, who have been really at the vanguard of figuring out ways to get people to participate who wouldn't otherwise participate or couldn't otherwise participate in Be Heard Philly, and have been very successful in doing that.
Great. So let's do two more sort of quick questions and responses in the interest of men not dominating the conversation. We'll have one, and then we'll have a woman ask a question, and then we'll close. So if you want to go.
Okay, I can speak very loud. So my question is actually many of our research is based on the data, how we define the data. Let's think about this way. If you live in the east corner of a census tract, who will impact you most? Maybe the neighborhood on your other side, instead of what you define the census tract. So I'm just questioning. There is some new methodological developments is bring the human being as a center of the measurements instead of an abstract kind of area you define it as a neighborhood. That's the first thing. The second thing is we use distance, calculate the distance, average distance. However, what really matters a lot for human being is our activity space every day. So for that is how you expose to instead, sometimes how far you can travel, or sometimes you have to travel, is you live very far from your employment site. Or some people afford, say, I want to live a very good, very beautiful place. I can afford the travel. So, and also, more and more new spatial analysis find out that we have a strong spatial correlation in the origin and destination. So we also need to consider the spatial structure of the city, how the spatial structure of the city really will influence the isolation. Right, so, okay, that's.
Thank you. Quick
I think that he
responses.
meant the question for you.
I feel like that's a question for me, but I also feel like it's more like comments than question, I guess. I think those all make sense. I agree. Actually, from our composition analysis, it's actually directly support what you're saying, your third point, right? So the destination where you're from definitely influence where you're going. For the size of the activity space, that's actually, we didn't call it activity space, but when we analyze our radius, we actually use weightage measures. So it's, that's why you see the number are actually not that high. That's, for Boston, it's under 4 kilometers. That's actually how we measured the meaningful activities. If they are meaningful movement areas, if they visit one location more, then we give more weight to that, kind of like find out where they're going. I forgot what's your second question?
First one.
The second one?
So I think you can continue this afterwards, because that was a.
But I think that's good comment. Thank you.
A good and long and detailed response. So maybe one more quick question, and then we'll wrap up. A woman this time.
Thank you all so much. This is really fascinating. I am curious, just sort of on that same question, just for the two of you who I think the last two talks talked about neighborhoods. And I'm just very curious, when you go on like the Harvard Dataverse site, you download the BARI neighborhoods data, and you look at it, and Back Bay is like, a tenth the size of Dorchester or Roxbury. Are those still, these neighborhoods that we use in Boston, are those meaningful measures? And what would we have to do to have something that is useful in 2018?
The neighborhood definition that we use for the Child Opportunity Index that I showed is census tracts. However, Clemens is going to talk later about other data that we are using also by census tract, but trying to utilize the definitions of neighborhoods that are used in Boston. And we often hear questions about how valid those are. I think that they are valid in the sense that they continue to be used for a lot of administrative purposes by the city. And I think it's very important to think about what are the perceptions of residents of what their neighborhood really is. I'm all for that kind of research that I see as more sociological, but I think that for some of the inequality research, we have to continue using very standardized definitions of neighborhoods so that we can compare with other cities and metros, and also go back and forth between the census tract definition that is very widely used in academic research and also the admin definitions. So to the extent that we can go back and forth, I think we will do a better job. And Clemens will talk about that. Clemens not here later today.
Great. So we're only 1 minute over, so that's not that bad. I want to thank the panelists. I want to thank BARI for hosting this event and beginning this very interesting discussion and dialogue. And thank you all for attending. Have a great day here. Have a great weekend. Thank you.
I love the dialogue between the index. Thank you so much for that.